Thanks for this opportunity to come out tonight to represent Tremont and by extension, Great Smoky Mountains National Park. For those unfamiliar, Tremont is a nonprofit partner of the park. A lot of people come in to our door and wonder, what's the deal? Why are we part of the Park Service? How come no one's in a green and gray Park Service uniform? The reason is because we go back to 1969 when a bunch of local educators, as well as the then editor of the Daily Times, got together and said, hey, those buildings that were part of the old Job Corps Center that was there during the Johnson administration, the Job Corps Center folded and they were going to bulldoze the buildings. And these folks got together and said, hey, what if we saved those buildings, turned the gymnasium into a dining hall and the old machine shop into a dormitory, and had people come up and learn about the Smokies, and mostly kids, and that's been the model ever since. That's just a real quick snapshot about Tremont. There's more that we do there than just work with school groups. That's our bread and butter programs, but we also have a lot of college programs. University of Georgia and Purdue and University of Central Florida are there as we speak. And we also have a lot of adult education programs. So my goal tonight is to share with you a lot about the Smokies. Nothing terribly in-depth, but just touching on many subjects. It's not meant to overwhelm you with information, but it is to give you a holistic sense of the park, what makes it special, some of the challenges it faces. That green shape, somewhat egg-shaped thing in the middle, that's the park, just to remind us where we are. We're going to start in the past, right? And this is a reminder that the Cherokee were the first people, the principal people, not only in where the park is. They were holders of land in what is now 6 different states before having their land severely reduced by Andrew Jackson and marched out west during the very tragic part of American history known as the Trail of Tears. However, as many Cherokee people will tell you themselves and have told us at Tremont, that is one episode in their history. They do not want to dwell on just the tragic episode and be reminding people that they are a vibrant, flourishing culture in the present day. And they are our neighbors over the mountain. And there's people in East Tennessee, Western North Carolina, and abroad with Cherokee heritage. The Kituwa people is what they originally called themselves. The Cherokee name came a little later. Kituwa means from here, which is pretty poetic. You think we're the people from here. European settlers arrived in this region fairly late when you consider when the first European settlers arrived on the eastern shores, right? Which was in 1500s for the most part. The late 1700s, what's going on? Why so late? Well, the Appalachians back then, the southern Appalachians in particular, were the Wild West. That makes sense, right? Prior to Lewis and Clark, right? This was the Wild West, so it was not settled until the Scotch-Irish mostly came down, plus some English, German folks, and took up land holdings because the land was cheap. In many places hilly, and the soil washed out, and they moved on after a few years. Those of you who have family that go back generations in this region, I'm guessing have some Scotch-Irish heritage. Those folks originally, generations back, would have come in through the Port of Philadelphia and then traveled south, and perhaps after a generation, down the Great Valley Road, what is basically now Interstate 81. So when you drive Interstate 81, up into Virginia towards Shenandoah, you're kind of going back into time on the old wagon road. Just when you're headed north, you're just going the wrong direction. I'm going to touch a little bit on Walker Valley. That's where Tremont is located. This is Will Walker and Nancy Walker. They settled there just prior to the Civil War as a young married couple, age 21 and 19 respectively. Will Walker is said to have said when he was growing up in what was then Tuckaleechee Cove, which is present-day Townsend, said, I'm going to live at the foot of that mountain someday that looks like a stack of fodder. Stack of fodder is winter feed for animals, for livestock, and mountain is Fodder Stack Mountain, which is right at Tremont. And so he and Nancy moved in and proceeded to spend the rest of their lives there. Nancy is said to have never left the valley once she moved in there. She spent the whole rest of her life there. The photo on your right is interesting. Look in the very background, you notice that there are leaves on the trees. So this is not a winter scene. This is the growing season. So why are all those trees dead? Well, that's how they settled land back then. When you don't have a team of people with crosscut saws yet, right? This is before the logging era, and you don't have anybody except you and your spouse, you're going to girdle a tree, right? Cut around the cambium layer of it, and that's all you gotta do. Cut an inch in the whole way around, and the tree dies, the leaves wither and fall, and the sunlight gets through the canopy now. There is no canopy, right? And you plant your corn all underneath those dead trees for maybe 10, 15 years. And you have all the firewood you could possibly want for a number of years. So that's just one little glimpse into just how hardy, resourceful, hardworking these folks were. We live in an age today of specialists. These folks back then, by necessity, were generalists. They knew a lot, a little bit, sometimes more than a little, about a lot. So Nancy was Will's only legal wife. Here's where the story gets really interesting, folks. That was right before the Civil War. They came up, and during the Civil War, they had some children into the 1870s. Nancy was a very slender woman, and 3 of her children died in childbirth. After the end of her 7th birth, she was afraid she was gonna die. She told Will, no more babies. So she gave her blessing to Will to build a cabin and to take as his second wife, Mary Ann Moore, who was a woman in her 20s, who was the midwife for Nancy. She was from North Carolina. Her brother back in North Carolina caught wind of this, decided he was going to come up to Walker Valley and tell Will Walker a piece of his mind. And he got here and he ended up liking Walker Valley so much and Will Walker so much he decided to stay. And not only that, but he ended up marrying one of Nancy and Will's daughters. So if you can do the family tree in your mind, good luck. But that made him simultaneously brothers-in-law with Will Walker and son-in-law to Will Walker. So that's unusual. There are plenty of stereotypes about Appalachia out there. This was not a regular occurrence, and so it did make the newspapers. There were reports that the Mormons were living up in Walker Valley with 54 kids. It was half of that, which is still a lot of kids, eventually. Mal Stinnett eventually comes by a few years later as the 3rd wife, and he builds a separate cabin for her. What explains this in part is that, a couple of things. Right after the Civil War, there were not a lot of young men of marrying age around, right? It's a fairly isolated region, not an easy place to meet people. And on top of that, Will Walker read his scriptures. He had 2 books over the course of his lifetime on in his cabin. One was the Holy Bible, and one was a biography of Ulysses S. Grant. He was a Union sympathizer, and he kept Confederate soldiers from entering Walker Valley because he did not believe in the slave economy. He believed the government of the United States was right in that conflict. But in the Holy Scriptures, he read plenty of accounts of King Solomon and all the rest. Many spouses. So colorful history, one big happy family, enough kids to have 3 baseball teams. 27. They did not all live long lives. There's an rich African-American heritage in the Smokies. That's not as well known. Some research has been done in recent years. There were a number of families, including at Tremont, that were black families. There was a doctor, Dennis Branch, who was over closer to Newport, who was very well liked by his community. Couldn't sit in the same restaurants, in the front of the restaurants, as his clients. 12 young men came over from North Carolina, where slavery was more prevalent than in East Tennessee. East Tennessee, we wonder why Friendsville is called Friendsville. It's the Quakers, right? And of course, the Presbyterian influence here. This was fairly staunchly abolitionist. But 12 young men, black young men, came over the mountain from North Carolina to the Smokies to volunteer for the Union Army. And there's been more research done on some of the cemeteries of enslaved people in North Carolina that we hope to learn more about in the coming years. Education, back to stereotypes for a minute. There's a stereotype of the Appalachian hillbilly, right? Drunk with a jar of moonshine, sitting against a tree with a straw hat, those images come to mind. Not very accurate. They wanted education and they wanted to be considered modern just like everybody else. They did not necessarily buy into all of the things of modernity. But they did want education. Will Walker went to Maryville College. They couldn't help him, but they put him in touch with some women's groups who funded a teacher to come up starting in 1901. And they had a schoolhouse up there that was known as the first teacherage in the United States, where the teacher lived during the summer term. Long about the turn of the century, 1900, things really began to change. Not quite yet in Walker Valley, but in the Smokies. That was a little later because Will Walker he refused to sell to the logging companies. And so if you want to see the youngest forest in the whole national park, you see it when you go to Tremont and you hike to Spruce Flats Falls or drive up the river valley. That was the last watershed to be logged because he held out, and once he died, the land went to his daughters and eventually went to the lumber company. This was certainly a significant event in this region when the big companies came in. There had been small logging operations before then, but never had there been industrial logging, and the reason why it was fairly late, again, 1900 is when you look at the records. The mid-Atlantic states, the upper Midwest, the new Northeast had all been logged out by then. Well, until 1900, with the invention of the Shea engine up in Michigan, I think in the 1890s, they couldn't figure out how to get a narrow gauge railroad up into the hollers here in the Smokies. When they finally did that, they laid the tracks, and there were scenes like this. A lot of board lumber coming out of the Smokies, most of that going to Europe. So if you ever travel in Europe and you see old wood, chestnut, white oak, tulip, you're probably looking at American lumber, maybe possibly from the Smokies. But it had bad consequences. This was wholesale logging, or what today we call clear cutting, and this was before ecological practices were thought of, and they just took everything. And so you had scenes like this left behind where a train's gonna come by and a spark's gonna catch all the wood on fire, but you think, well, that'd be good, burn it all up. But what it really does is it burns all of the microbial life in the topsoil that's trying to decompose it. And so it ends up setting back regeneration. In this photo, you have another environmental catastrophe going on, and that is the loss of topsoil. If you look on the left-hand side, you see those three drag lines, as were called skidder lines. You get a log off a mountainside by cutting it down way up on the mountainside, put a bolt in it, and then you drag it down, right? Seven-person crew would do this, put it in the train at the bottom. Well, now that the hillside is denuded of trees, and you have a natural place where there's a new creek bed forming, all of that topsoil gets washed away. And it can take a long time for topsoil to build up. Not only is the topsoil gone, but now the trout habitat from southern brook trout is filled up with muck, and they die out in many places. So people stood around saying, what happened to the trout? Well, we should stock it. And so they stocked it with European brown trout and rainbow trout from the western states. There is restoration going on in the park that has been actually very successful in restoring much of the former brook trout habitat, but we have a long way to go. But if you want to know why it is we have non-native trout like rainbows and browns here, it's largely because of the logging era and the unintended consequences. Well, along about in the early 1920s, a fairly wealthy couple, Knoxville business folks, who traveled to Yellowstone every year and loved it, but wanted a national park closer, said, why can't we have a national park in the Smokies? It's a 3,000-mile train ride every summer to the nearest national park. Let's have one in the Smokies. So they were credited for largely starting the movement. There was a contingent in Asheville that wanted the Linville Gorge to be the national park. Can you imagine if they had won out? Thank heavens, they did not. But then the Knoxville contingent. And it was quite a challenge that they had because the national parks out west, the big wilderness parks, think Grand Canyon, think Yellowstone, Yosemite. Now, other than displacing indigenous people there that had lived there for thousands of years and used it as hunting grounds, Those people did not have full citizenship status, so it was easy to kick them out. That was in the 1800s. Other than that, it was as simple as drawing a circle on the map and saying this is now a national park, right, with those parks. Here in the East, this place had a lot of people using the land, living on the land. So this was a mammoth undertaking. And I'm going to breeze through it. There's been a whole book written about this, the birth of a national park, I believe that's what it's called. But long story short, they had to raise $10 million, half of which was private money, including kids going door to door. They had essay contests in the local schools in Knoxville. And kids asked for pledges, and then they turned the money in. And then the other half came from John D. Rockefeller Jr., who, unlike his oil magnate father, was a little more generous with his money. He grew up reading James Fenimore Cooper, right? Last of the Mohicans. He loved the idea of being close to nature, and read Thoreau, and he wanted that for his employees in his factories. And so that's why we have the Rockefeller Monument, the big stone wall at Newfound Gap. So they raised the money. And the Smokies is the first national park that was purchased from private land by private citizens, which is why to this day its nickname is the People's Park. So when you think about like, well, who owns the Smokies? Well, this was not a top-down government land grab. This was local people saying we want a national park. That's a pretty great story to tell. And that's, I think, something East Tennessee and Western North Carolina should be very proud of. All right, moving right along. What's so special about the Smokies? Well, a lot of things. It's a short answer. The landscape itself, there's no park this size that has, contiguous forest, meaning unbroken forest. A couple roads going through the park, but really not that many. A lot of the rest are around the borders. It's a World Heritage Site, International Biosphere Reserve. International bodies have designated the Smokies of that much importance. And then the one at the bottom is one we'll touch on a little bit more, which is the most biodiverse ecosystem in North America. Not the most people-friendly term, biodiverse, but what it means is the range of life, right? Noah's Ark. You would need a very, very big ark if you had to march two by two onto this ark. Fortunately, we have one. It's the Smokies. What accounts for this? Well, in part, there's a lot of water here. We're in a temperate region. There's a lot of rainwater. Life loves water. And we have almost 3,000 miles of streams flowing out of the park, the headwaters of the Tennessee River. There's old growth forests here, which that term could be a little bit misleading. Original forest, mixed-aged forest are other terms. But it means it was never logged. And so if you've ever gone up a Laurel Falls Trail or Ramsey Cascade Trail, you've seen some of the biggest trees in the eastern United States. Back to biodiversity. So the plant life here is astounding. Now, if you were to look at the lists, the brag sheets, the Amazon, of course, has a lot more tree species, plant species. But that's in the tropics, right? Closer to the equator. A growing season is longer, even more moisture. So for being in the temperate region, this is pretty remarkable. 135 tree species is more than the entire continent of Europe. So just let that sink in. You can go out, even in parts of Marable here, you can go out and see more tree species, native tree species, than they have in all of Yellowstone. All of Yellowstone's 4 times the size of the Smokies, 9 species of trees, right? It's more arid, right? Diversity of animal life here. If there's a lot of plant life, right, that's the building blocks of any ecosystem, then there's a lot of animal life. Almost as many mammals here as the entire state of North Carolina. And we are the salamander capital of the world. You should know that. And they should make t-shirts. Just, it should be the Marable Salamanders. I don't know why someone doesn't make that their mascot. Including this little guy. This is the red-cheeked salamander, Jordan's red-cheeked salamander. It only lives in the Smokies and nowhere else. Scientific term for that is endemic. Right, it only lives here and nowhere else, mid and high elevation. So you won't see it in Cades Cove, you won't see it at Tremont. Go up to Chimney Tops picnic area, thereabouts, and other higher locations. And turn over a rock or a log and you stand a good chance of seeing one. Well, here's the reasons why there's so much biodiversity here without going into great detail. There's high precipitation. Life loves water. The elevation extremes. The park goes from 800 feet above sea level. We're at the mouth of Abrams Creek, far western end of the park, up to what used to be called Kleeman's Dome. It's now Kawohe. That's 6,600 feet. You're going 800 feet to 6,600 feet, all within a given area. That's quite a variety of elevations. And elevation mimics latitude. So when you drive up to Newfound Gap, it's like you're driving up to Maine, if that makes sense. Mountain aspect has to do with the shape of the mountains. Is it facing to the north? It's more shade, more moisture retention. Facing to the south, more sunlight. Different species of trees and plants and animals like those different conditions. And then finally, the glaciers never reached here, but the cold temperatures did. And the glaciers, when they advanced at the beginning of the last ice age, chased species southward that now, or they're southerners now. They talk with a southern twang. Right? So like if you go up to Newfound Gap, you see spruce and fir. Those should not be down here, right? You'd have to drive the whole way to New York or Pennsylvania to see those trees, spruce trees at least. They're here because of the ice age. They found refuge in the high elevations. I'm not going to go into this a lot, but when you visit the forest in the Smokies, look closely because it's not just one big woods. There are different forests there. You can be on, for instance, Lumber Ridge Trail, and within a quarter mile, go from pine and oak and go around the bend where there's more shade and the mountain aspect is different, therefore the rainfall lasts longer, and be in Cove Hardwood Forest. So again, we're just kind of appreciating right now just the amazing variety of life that there is in the Smokies and the complexity, which makes it a very fun place to get to know over a lifetime. Discover Life in America, which is another park partner, has undertaken a quarter-century-long project with scientists from all over the world to document all the species in the park. If you inherited a museum, but there was no list of all of the artwork in the museum, you first want to go in and get an inventory, right? And you want to know, what are the oldest ones? We got to take care of those ones first. Well, that's what this project is. It's like, okay, if we're going to take care of the Smokies, we better know what's here. And so in the last quarter century, they have found 11,000 species that they didn't know were there before, including 1,000 that were new to science, never been described. That's the scientific term. That's amazing. Again, back to the question, what's so special about the Smokies? Well, the cultural heritage and history of this place is phenomenal. I mean, the number of cabins that are preserved in relatively good condition, despite people carving their names in them. There is the largest collection of log cabins in the whole Park Service. That's 400 plus park units nationwide. We're gonna get a little nerdy here on numbers. Is that okay? Briefly. The park budget is about, this is last year's numbers, 21 million. Up until January, there were about 200 permanent employees. It's down to 163. Some of those people took a buyout. Some of them, their positions were axed. And it's unlikely that they will be filled, for the short term at least. Annual visitors is 12 million. It's 15,000 jobs and bringing in over $2 billion annually. That's a moneymaker, just from a purely pragmatic financial point of view. Here's a challenge that the park is facing right now. The park has struggled financially for years. Now, I do want to add a caveat that there is such a thing as governmental waste. However, the issue with the Smokies is that since sequestration, which is how the federal government moved on in 2010 to pass a budget, what they did was they froze the budgets of the national parks. Now, national parks that have an entrance fee, that's not terrible. Does the Smokies have an entrance fee? It does not, which means out of those 12 million people coming into the park every year, think of the money lost. Now, that's not an argument necessarily on behalf or not on behalf of an entrance fee, but it's just to show the financial straits the park has been in. So if you look at these numbers, 25 years ago, the budget was only $2.5 million less than it is today. That is not keeping up with inflation. So, meanwhile, visitation, even in my time there, I started at Tremont in the mid-90s. There are millions of people more. The number back then was 9 million people a year. During COVID, in 2020 and 2021, 14 million people visited the Smokies. We do have a parking fee now that is 2 years old. And I'm happy to report that it's been very successful. Well, nobody likes to pay for anything. And you think like, well, why do I have to pay to go visit the woods, right? I get that. The issue here is that you have roads you got to maintain, bathrooms, all that infrastructure, let alone the educational programs, also taking care of the forest itself. So the Smokies has been dealing with this for a long time. The former superintendent, Cassius Cash, came up with the idea of the parking fee, which has brought in money that has helped quite a bit. And what they discovered is that the people who are most compliant to the rule, meaning like they actually get the parking fees, are local people, right? Makes sense. They get it. They want to see their park taken care of. There's a silver lining to being underfunded or to be in a very populous area, which is that there's a lot of people that love the Smokies and want to help. And they figure out ways to do it. And this is just the 4 park partners, right? So Tremont is on there, of course. Discover Life in America, I mentioned. Friends of the Smokies, their sole reason for existence is to raise money for the park. And they have fundraisers throughout the year. And then Smokies Life puts out that wonderful magazine you may have seen. They staff all the gift shops and visitor centers. So these are all organizations that are nonprofit. They're citizen-generated just to support the national park. And if you look at the bottom there, look at the volunteers and the volunteer hours. It's so valuable. You can't do that in all national parks. Some of them are just in 2 remote areas, but in the Smokies, it's pretty great to be involved directly with your national park. All right, moving right along here. Threats to the Smokies, what are some of them? Some of these may be familiar to you. There is poaching. If there's no entrance fee to the park, then there's no guard gate, there's no gate closing up the park at night. There's pros and cons to that. But one thing means people can go in at night, and when I lived in the park for 11 years, and there were cars going by at very strange hours. I actually reported that up to Park Dispatch, and they said, well, if you can find a pattern, like what nights of the week or day, and I never could establish a pattern, especially because it was about 2 a.m. I'm happy to report that some of this is on the decline compared to, say, 20 years ago. But vandalism of park buildings, especially in Kate's Cove, Little Greenbrier Schoolhouse, you've probably seen it. That's permanent damage. There's only so much they can do about it. There is one way they've been able to catch folks. That's when someone carves their name in a building, takes a photo of it, puts it on Facebook. They've actually nabbed a couple people that way. Pretty satisfying. Invasive species. If this is a hospitable place for all the native species, so it is for newcomers, right? Invaders. Kudzu, Hemlock woolly adelgid, the chestnut blight, the European wild boar. An invasive species doesn't just mean it's foreign, it's from somewhere else. It means that it tends to overtake its environment, robs nutrients from native species. So there's a distinction there. Just because it's from outside doesn't mean it's bad. There are medicinal uses the Cherokee made for plants that they saw growing after European settlers came through. But the species that take over and really alter the environment, those are the ones that the park has to have a team to keep up with. Another issue facing the Smokies is just the sheer number of people. We are within a day's drive of 1/3 of the US population. That's a challenge. It's a wonderful thing, but it's a lot of people. And when you look at the numbers there, that's quite a number of people, 12 million people coming through. Habitat loss around the edges of the park from overdevelopment is what we're talking about. People come here, they love it, they want to build a cabin. We all do. Who doesn't want to have a cabin in the woods, right? But it means that you start changing the very thing that you're loving, and at a certain point you love something to death. The Smokies has been described by some people as having kind of an ugly bathtub ring of development around the edges. It's not in all places, not in Happy Valley. Some places in towns and over Maggie Valley, pretty rampant, right? And near Gatlinburg, Pittman Center, that area, or Ware Valley, certainly. This is not to point fingers, but it is to say that at a certain point, what is the capacity of the land? That you can keep what you want and have that rural sensibility when especially your farmland is not being farmed by the younger generation and is being sold off, and now there's condos or cabins. So this is a challenge to the park, not because it's happening in the park, but because of the scenic views from the park. You can stand on Mount LeConte and actually point out specific buildings in Pigeon Forge because they're so big and prominent. And also the wildlife. The wildlife do not get to the edge of the park and say, oh, this is the border, I should turn back now. They need permeability, they need wildlife corridors. Right? Air pollution is an issue because we are east and downwind of a lot of coal-fired power plants. We have a long ways to go, but we are trending in the right direction with air quality and cleaning it up from the nitrates and sulfates that come out of coal-fired power plants. Climate change, we don't really know exactly what's going to happen is in the future, but we already can tell that some of those red-cheeked salamanders are not as abundant in the mid-elevations where they once were. And the reason for that is the air is warmer and there's less fog, there's less moisture in the air. They're doing great at the high elevations, not so much at the mid-elevations. That's just one example. The spruce fir, that's that ice age forest, that's the dark green that you see mostly on the eastern part of the park. In the middle, that's the highest elevations. Well, when you're already at the high points in the mountains, that's the Sky Islands, there's no further up to go, right? Now, some scientists at Oak Ridge National Lab have created models that seem to suggest that there is enough cloud cover in the high elevations to insulate cold temperatures enough for the spruce fir. But what that means for the low elevations and the mid elevations as time goes on, who's to say? Ecological restoration, let's talk about that a little bit. So this is kind of looking into the past, but also the future. So at the end of the logging era, the black bears were almost wiped out, as were white-tailed deer. It's hard to kind of picture that, right? White-tailed deer being endangered, you know, they were few in number because the forest was gone, but also the hides were wanted, right, for the tanning industry. These species bounced back on their own. They did not need any handouts. There are other species that were native here, were here and are gone. So the scientific term for that is extirpated. They're not extinct from the world. They're just gone from this region. And there were some species that were here and then displaced from the logging era and from hunting, and then brought back successfully. Elk, river otters, peregrine falcons, smoky madtots, a little tiny fish. So that's some good news. They tried to bring back the red wolf back in the 90s. When I was up at Tremont, you could hear the red wolves howling. But the habitat was just not right for them. They don't take down deer. They don't attack people. They actually eat small mammals. And in the dense forest, the small mammal population was just not abundant enough. So they kept going out and ranging. The Tremont wolf went the whole way up over Thunderhead Mountain, down into Bryson City and back in a day, looking for food. That's a long ways. So they canceled that program. And meanwhile, coyotes got here on their own. So is that native or not? Well, it's kind of in between because they got here because the cougars, the large predators, the cougars and the wolves were killed off, right, during the settler period. Never tried to bring back the cougars. There's no plan to do that, but it's a thought. It's a good thought experiment. What would it mean to have the Smokies with large predators back on the landscape? Now, some people have seen cougars over the years. Very rarely has happened. even in mid Tennessee. But those are typically young males from western states that are looking for a mate and traveling through. They usually get shot or hit by a car. So there is no established population of cougars. And this is not me advocating for one, but when you think like the Rockies has a complete food chain. We don't in the Smokies or in the East. We don't have wolves, we don't have cougars. What would it mean to bring those back? Well, that's a debate for another day. But back in the 90s, Southerners said, yeah, we'll welcome the red wolf back. Oh, actually, we're okay with raising a tax by, it was like 1/16 of a penny to help pay for the program. So I think there's maybe promise for rethinking that down the road. Well, what's the point of all this? Why is the park spending the time thinking about, okay, what are all the species here? How do we take care of the trees? How do we bring back the animals that were locally extinct? Well, it's for that magic word, biodiversity. You have all the parts to a landscape. When you have all the parts, it works properly, just like the human body. Here's an illustration. This is when they brought the large predators back to Yellowstone. So back in the 1920s, the Park Service, your friendly park rangers, actually were paid to shoot and kill wolves and cougars. This is before the era of ecological thinking, of realizing, oh, nature is kind of like the body, like what we just said, right? You need all the parts for it to function. So what happened as a result is over a half century, elk were overpopulated because there's no predators. The beavers can't get established because the elk are eating all the food. And the forest, especially along rivers and in flatter areas, can't get going. So in the 90s, very controversial at the time, early 90s, they brought back the wolves. And within a few short years, the beavers started coming back because there were young shoots of trees coming up on the land because the elk weren't eating all of them. So that's just an illustration. This is not a controversial idea today at all. A lot of times controversial ideas become kind of obvious a little later on. Well, that's enough on that. I'm going to show you a slide. This is threats to the Smokies. Guess what this next slide is going to show? What do you think it's going to be? Every time I do this, someone always says, people, we're always so bad. Maybe, but maybe not exactly in the way you think. What if it were this? What if it were complacency? What if it were being away from the actual physical world, indoors, insulated with our machines, in our Instagrams, making us so happy, actually probably pretty unhappy, especially if you're of a certain age and being influenced by that, right? What if having an overly safe generation of kids is bad in the long run? And that if you don't know nature firsthand, why would you seek to preserve it? It just becomes something out there. And if you're insulated by your machines, then you get very scared about the world and entering out into it and talking to people that are different than you. Because people are as diverse as the Smokies, right? And getting a little bug bit, maybe poison ivy once in a while, and getting dirt in your fingernails. We're taught that you don't want to do that. But that's what we need, right? Just a little glimpse into that, the number of hunters in the state of Tennessee declines by about 5% every year. Why am I talking about that? Because that's another example of what we stand to lose when we don't have people firsthand doing things on the landscape. We've all been kind of trained that humans can only do bad to nature. And I would question that and would urge you to question whether that's the case, right? We need hunters because hunters self-tax by buying hunting licenses, which are one of the main reasons why we have land preserved in the state of Tennessee. This is the case everywhere. So environmentalists and hunters and farmers are not enemies. They are natural allies. if you look at reality, you look at what is fundamental and what is the unifying principle for all of us, which is the ground beneath our feet, right? Well, let's just take this thought a little bit further. All the words on the left have something in common. They were all removed from the 2007 Oxford Junior Dictionary. Not enough room for all the words, so you have to remove some. And they were replaced by attachment, blog, broadband, bullet point, cut and paste, voicemail. So in our literature, it becomes abstract, about abstract ideas, and is no longer bound to reality. What does that look like a generation down the road? Right? Very sobering. Richard Louv wrote a book 20 years ago now about nature deficit disorder, right? This is the phenomenon of like, well, Johnny, I don't want you playing outside because that's where you could get hurt. I want you safe and I want you on the couch. And so here's the remote. And you become disconnected and you learn about nature far away and how bad everything is going. And climate change is going to kill us all. And so you have ecophobic kids with rates of depression going up, et cetera, et cetera. Now, does all of this go back to not spending enough time in nature? A heck of a lot of it is, I would argue. So, some sobering thoughts, but let's wrap it back around. Well, so what are national parks good for, including the Smokies? National parks, on a purely pragmatic level, national parks create jobs, right? And real economic impact to rural communities in many respects that need those jobs. They're laboratories for experiential education. Let's get those kids outside and let's see what happens when they're away from the machines and they're with their teachers and it's not just like for an hour, but all day for several days in a row. I can tell you firsthand, the Tremont, it's a life-changing experience for what those kids do. National parks, they foster local and national pride. That's a wonderful thing, right? It is not a sin to feel national pride when it's rooted, especially in the land, right? National parks provide places to get away, especially if it's a cell phone free zone. So far, not all the satellites have been able to reach to every last holler. So when we take kids backpacking at Tremont, they go away for 3-4 days and they come back, and this is not our goal. We're not prompting them to do this, but we've had teenagers say, I'm getting off Facebook. I'm closing my account, because they know that's where all of their time goes. Now that they've actually seen the real world, the alternatives, it can be a really moving experience for them. National parks are places where we are reminded that we are not in control, ultimately, of our own destinies. We cannot control the world. And lastly, national parks are reservoirs of cultural memory. They are continuity, right, through the ages, through the times, which is a really good thing when we tend to lose sight of the past and the future and think the past is only full of wrongs and the future is all dark. National parks have something different to teach us. So, last thought or two, how you can support the Smokies. Volunteer your time. You can donate money. Next time you go around Kate's Cove Loop, you see that little white box at the end. Please donate. They could use that money. Support your partner organizations. You can call elected officials. Tell them, I want that park funded. I want that park protected. Enjoy the park. Here's my little bit of homework I'm going to leave you all with. If you have a young person in your life, even remotely, next time they come visit, whatever, kidnap them legally. Take them outside. Take them to the park. Get out of the vehicle and go tromping. Have them go to a creek, turn over some rocks. Let them mess around and be a little wild. We could all use a little bit of that, I believe.